Hey, how's it going? My name is Brian White. I'm Director of Engineering at Intercom. I want to talk about ActiveRecord and some of the problems with ActiveRecord. Before I get too negative on it, I think it's probably important to point out that ActiveRecord is far more successful than any software I've ever contributed to or will ever write in my life. ActiveRecord's pretty amazing. I just think that the class of software it's in, ORMs, can introduce some dangerous patterns into your app. I'm not going to talk about any dodgy SQL. I think Kieran's covered that pretty well. There's lots of good tactical things you can do, like our SQL fingerprinting is pretty magical, like Kieran says. But this is more about kind of the long-term thing. And I think that's an important distinction to make, is that ActiveRecord is great when you're starting out. So what I'm about to say, I don't think really applies to you so much if this is for a side project or this is something you're trying out and you're trying to get customers. If you're at the early stages of your app, don't worry about anything I'm going to say. It's only when you're successful, I think, is when this might become an issue for you. And that's what's happening for us, right? Intercom is going to be 4 years old this year. We're doing really well. We have those lovely hockey stick growth charts that investors love, and as a someone with some stock options, I'm quite pleased about too. Our growth is really great, and we're being really successful. And now we're hitting some scaling problems because of the way we've used ActiveRecord. And I think the way we've used ActiveRecord is not that different from how most people use it. So I suppose I'd like to talk a bit about successful software. And I agree with Fred here. Successful software always gets changed. If it wasn't successful, nobody would care and nobody would want to change it. So I think that's why people get pretty hung up on the idea of technical debt. And we certainly pay a lot of attention to it. For each new piece of the product we build, I think we ask ourselves a lot of questions about technical debt and what we can improve as we build our product. I think, though, the main reason to get hung up on technical debt is because it's like a risk to your agility. How fast you can move, how fast you can change, can you stay successful is kind of tied to how fast you can move. And I think your culture defines how agile you are. Your engineering culture kind of sets you up for how quickly you can move. And as much as we mightn't like it, I think our technology choices kind of define or certainly put a framework or shape our culture. I think the fact that this is a Ruby meetup and that most of us here probably use Rails, I think is a good sign that most people in this room actually care about agility, because I think that's where I think that's basically why Rails won the web framework war. I'm not sure if that's controversial, probably not in this room. Is because it's all about agility. You get it going fast, you have something working quickly. It's not the most performant thing. It's not the most garbage collection in Ruby before 2.1 is pretty terrible, but nobody really cares because you get to implement that cool feature and you just throw more CPU at it and everyone's happy. So for us at Intercom, I think continuous deployment shaped most of our cultures so far. I think for me, it's the three stages of Intercom engineering culture that I've seen would probably be the Rails dominated one of move quickly and get that into our culture, and then continuous deployment so we can do big things safely and quickly, which is worth the talk in itself. And for me, I reckon the next one for us that's going to shape our culture is how we learn to scale, how we learn to be a big successful company and hopefully become a big successful company. And I think that learning bit is interesting too, because again, with Fred Brooks, we're going to make a whole bunch of mistakes, and that's how we've learned a lot of our lessons so far. I think that's pretty natural and pretty normal. That said, though, like the two quotes I've had so far, I've got the years on them. There's a lot of good lessons out there that have been learned that we don't have to go through the painful expense ourselves of relearning. I think if we just paid a bit more attention to what's been done already, we could avoid some big mistakes ourselves. So for this, I'd like to talk about, I guess, just two problems really with ActiveRecord / ORMs, Declan. And the first one is from 2002. It's from Joel Spolsky. I actually remember reading this article, which dates me a bit, because that's 13 years ago now. And so Joel's point is that all non-trivial abstractions to some degree are leaky. And he talks about, I think in the article he talks about TCP. So IP is an unreliable transport protocol. Packets get lost, they get dropped, they get delivered out of order. TCP sits on top as an abstraction, and we get nice, like, reliable transport on top. Except that we don't always get reliable transport on top. Sometimes connections time out, sometimes hosts aren't available. His point is basically that abstractions are useful, and that's how we build really cool things really quickly, but they do leak from time to time, and you should be aware of that, and you should allow for that in how you design your programs. For me, I think ActiveRecord is definitely a leaky abstraction. I think that's pretty much why we built SQL fingerprinting. In fact, today, today's outage, I think, was pretty much caused by 2 ActiveRecord statements that looked almost exactly the same, but were formulated slightly differently. And one produced a reasonably efficient query, and the other just took out our database. And that's not uncommon. It happens, and we deal with it. But it is an example of the type of leaky abstraction that ActiveRecord can provide. And it's also quite pervasive. Once you start introducing ActiveRecord in your codebase, like you might have a scope defined in a model that gets modified a bit by a controller and then passed on to a template, and the template tacks on something else and renders it. And it's really at the template level that query got executed and fully defined. And that's pretty much touching all the levels of your Rails app. Like, that's from bottom to top. And that's quite pervasive. And that kind of takes me on to the next problem. This is not good relationship advice, by the way. This is from Ian Holland. Only talk to your immediate friends. He specified this as part of the law of Demeter. Again, from, was it 1987? Yeah, quite a while ago. This is not like cutting edge research, but research has been done on the law of Demeter, and it does show that you get less issues, you get less bugs, you get more maintainable code if you follow it or largely follow it. In case anyone's not familiar with it or needs a little bit of a refresher, let's just go through it quickly. So methods on an object should only call methods that are on the object itself, parameters passed to that method, and objects created by that method. Is it like a rough summation? I'll have a link to the full actual Northeastern University paper from 1987 that this came from. But it says that effectively you limit who you call, you limit what you know about in the system to what's effectively immediately in contact with you. Does that make sense? And if you think about it, that's not how we generally deploy ActiveRecord. ActiveRecord in our programs tends to be pretty widely used and pretty kind of like in the global scope. So one module might just reach in and touch application state somewhere else. And we do things like fat models to try and make that operation safer, but it's really just addressing the symptom, in my view, not the root cause. And the root cause is this entanglement. And that's where I think there's a big problem, because once you have that entanglement and you've got this ActiveRecord objects kind of spread around your code base, it becomes really difficult to change them later. And you will need to change them at some point if you get successful enough. I mean, that's pretty much what 2 of our most important engineering projects are right now, is to change the back-end storage for 2 of our really heavily used models that just aren't going to scale with a traditional database. But that's not easy because of how we've used ActiveRecord. So let's just take an example. I really hope you can read the code at the back. But this is about the simplest ActiveRecord model you can create. This is on like a Rails 4.2 project with, I'm pretty sure, no extra gems loaded that are adding anything to it. But there's no fields defined. There's nothing extra happening here. That table doesn't exist in the database or anything. That's just the simplest model we have. Anyone care to guess how many public methods it has? 450. It's kind of close. It's closer to about 600. Now, fair enough, like 99 of those do come from Ruby 2.1's object, but there's still nearly 500 methods there, which is kind of a lot, right? That's 500 methods that are fair game in your code base. They're public. They're legit. Like there's no way in a code review you can call those out as inappropriate use. That they're fine. So if you want to replace them, if you want to replace your active record calls or those active record objects with something else, you've potentially got 500 implementations to write or 500 implementations to fix when you call it. And some of those methods return things like an active record relationship. In fact, dozens of them do. An active record relationship, again, Rails 4.2, it's about 300 methods, public methods on that. So take away the 99 for Ruby's object, and you get to like a good solid 200 methods, public methods that you can call on this. And that's not to say their behavior as well like is easy to replicate. It's all quite based around a relational database. So to rip it out and to replace it with like DynamoDB is not as simple even as just replacing all those methods. There's quite a lot of work in there. And so I guess this gets me on to the real kind of crux, my real problem with ORMs. A guy called Ted Neward back in 2004 wrote a really great article. I think since then, Coding Horror has picked up and done a similar like blog post on it. But his point is object relational mapping is the Vietnam of computer science, and I've got to read his quote. So it represents a quagmire which starts well, gets more complicated as time passes, and before long entraps its users in a commitment that has no clear demarcation point, no clear win conditions, and no clear exit strategy. Which I think is a fair representation of ORMs. And again, this is like 11 years old. Someone had written this and gotten annoyed and found all these things before Intercom was even an idea in anyone's head. You know, we could have learned this lesson beforehand, but I think it's a reasonable path that we've taken through where we started off with ORMs, which gets us good efficiency, but now we kind of need to think about how we're going to evolve our technology. And I think that's the important point, is that this may not apply to you at all. You could be at such an early stage that this just doesn't matter to you, but I think now is the time to start thinking about encapsulation, thinking about how you put together and compose the operations that build up your application. Maybe not rely on ActiveRecord for absolutely everything in your application. Sure, there'll always be little edge cases where you just want to store some state and that's the easiest thing to do, but I really think if you've got some core models that are really kind of core to your business or what your application does, it's probably good to start wrapping them in earlier rather than later in some higher level abstraction, some higher level encapsulation. And I think a good smell for when something needs encapsulation is callbacks. Callbacks in ActiveRecord are another pain to remove. So there's this blog post by a guy called Brandon Weiss, who luckily has come. He wrote this back in February, and just this month he joined us in our San Francisco office, which is pretty great. But he has this good post, and I'll link to it at the end. But he talks about how, I'll just read it, almost every ActiveRecord callback I've ever written, I eventually removed later on after I realized it was actually contextual. It had only seemed like it should always run. And the example he gives is a pretty common one, I think, is he creates a user model, and then in an after create hook or after commit hook, there's send an email, like a welcome email. And then he sits down at the console one day, creates a bunch of users because he had to recreate them or reinitialize some state, and it sends off 20 emails because that's what the callback does. It executes every time. And so really what's probably a better approach is to have, say, one operation for creating an email, or sorry, for creating a user, and another operation that says create a sign up. And as part of that operation, I'll create a user, and I'll also create an email, a welcome email to them. Or I could use Intercom for the welcome email. And just provide that higher level abstraction and start using that, start returning from those operations plain old Ruby objects rather than ActiveRecord objects, and preferably immutable plain old Ruby objects, but that's for another talk. So that's it. Any questions? Sure. So the question is, like, how do I get rid of ActiveRecord, or why would why would I get rid of ActiveRecord? How do I do my core business classes without using ActiveRecord? So I think it's fine to use ActiveRecord internally, but I think really what you're looking to do is provide an API, an internal API on top of that that hides the ActiveRecord usage. Like, I think ActiveRecord's a pretty awesome piece of software. I just think it's the proliferation in the code base that's dangerous. So I think it's absolutely fine to have an internal, like, create customer call that under the hood grabs a customer model and calls create bang. But it's kind of defining that kind of choke point or that one interface into how you create a user, rather than allowing every part of your code that needs to create a customer from calling ActiveRecord directly, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's a good point. Like, is there an active? Why can't there be like an ActiveRecord simple that, you know, cuts down all the public interface? You know, maybe there could be, like, there's a couple of like semi-joke jams that, like, Gary Bernhardt's one and Brandon Weiss's got one that respectively disable update methods that don't invoke callbacks because they're just plain old stupid, and Brandon's one prohibits callbacks in your ActiveRecord models. So kind of jokes, but not like serious jams. I suppose the important point of your question there is the luxury of having the time to do it. Yeah, absolutely, and it's like a total engineering trade-off decision. Like, get the feature out of the door before Friday, or do it sort of like what we think is the right way. I think that's just a trade-off that you have to kind of figure out in the context of your business. If it's something that it just needs to happen quickly, or if it's something where actually this is core, this is something that we need to get right. It's going to be a huge source of bugs in the future if it's not done right. Let's just take the time to do it, or go back and revisit it. But yeah, I think it's one of those. I'm not going to give you a definite answer because it's a tricky engineering trade-off kind of questions.
Would it be fair to do something like if ever two models need to be involved, just wrap it in a third-party class, and then have a method of that exposed that calls the first model to do its thing, the second model to do its thing, and then wrap the transaction if needed. If errors happen, transfer them over. But probably if you ever feel like you need a callback or present two objects, wrap it almost.
Yeah, that might not be a bad rule of thumb. I'm going to have to think through that, but Declan's point was if there's ever two objects that need to be updated at the same time, or if there's ever like callbacks involved with that, to wrap them in some higher level abstraction. I mean, that sounds kind of sensible to me, but I have to think through it.
Yeah, I've said it here.
So I'm just wondering if you've used active model as that higher level abstraction goal?
Not really, to be honest. Wanted to just get to an interface that we totally controlled and had like full control over the behaviors of. Particularly, one of the big pushes, which I really didn't really talk about at all tonight, is just immutability in our data stores. You know yourself, like, immutable state caches really well, and that's something we found works for us. Cool. Thanks a lot.
Cheers, Brian and Kieran. I think they were great talks myself. Really enjoyed them. Couldn't agree more on, note callbacks and things like that. They're all horrible. I'm also delighted that Brian's already, basically volunteered to do the immutability talk next month. So that's saving a bit of organisation headaches. So I think the plan is, we can hang out here for a while, have some beers down the back bar. There might be scraps of pizza left, or jump in behind that. There's probably a few bits of food on the floor there. And thanks very much to Intercom for hosting us tonight. I think it's been fantastic so far. I think it's going to be a great night, and we can all head somewhere later on if we run out of ideas here. Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.